Hello everyone, I'm Christopher Reynolds. And today we need to talk about something that should have every American paying close attention as the next election cycle approaches. Because what Donald Trump said recently wasn't just another rally remark. It wasn't an off-the-cuff joke. It wasn't a spontaneous exaggeration meant to energize a crowd. This time, it was deliberate, scripted, delivered carefully from a teleprompter, and the message was unmistakable. According to Trump, anyone who opposes strict voter ID laws must be trying to cheat. That single statement may sound familiar, but the context surrounding it reveals something far bigger, a coordinated political effort that critics argue could fundamentally reshape how Americans vote. Tonight, we're going to unpack what's happening, why it matters, and what could come next. During a recent major address, Donald Trump argued that voter ID laws are essential because, in his words, the only reason to oppose them is election cheating. Now, this framing is politically powerful. It reduces a complicated debate into a simple moral claim. If you disagree, you must be dishonest. But here's why analysts immediately took notice. Trump wasn't improvising. He wasn't riffing the way he often does at rallies. The remarks were structured, intentional, and clearly part of a broader legislative push centered around what Republicans call the SAVE Act. And according to supporters, the bill is about election security. According to critics, it's something entirely different. Supporters describe the SAVE Act as common-sense election reform, requiring stricter identification standards and proof of citizenship to vote. On paper, that may sound straightforward. After all, polls consistently show that many Americans support some form of voter identification. But critics argue the details tell a different story. They claim the legislation would dramatically narrow which forms of identification are acceptable, potentially excluding categories of voters who currently participate legally. For example, certain student IDs or alternative forms of identification might no longer qualify. Elderly voters without driver's licenses could face new barriers. Individuals whose legal names changed, including many married women, could encounter documentation mismatches requiring additional proof. And that's where the debate shifts from election security to voter access, because the question becomes not whether ID exists, but which IDs count and who gets excluded. Opponents of the bill argue that voter ID requirements are only one piece of a much larger strategy. They claim the legislation also encourages aggressive voter roll maintenance, meaning states would more frequently remove registrations deemed outdated or inconsistent. Supporters call this preventing fraud. Critics call it voter purging. And here's where the political stakes escalate dramatically. Some analysts believe these changes could disproportionately affect groups that historically vote Democratic: younger voters, urban populations, and people who move more frequently. Whether intentional or not, they argue, the outcome could reshape turnout patterns nationwide. Donald Trump himself has framed the issue in stark political terms. He has suggested that election reforms like these are necessary to ensure future Republican victories, even claiming at one point that certain changes could prevent Republicans from losing elections for decades. Supporters interpret that as confidence in stronger election integrity. Critics interpret it as something closer to an admission that changing voting rules can change electoral outcomes, and that distinction is exactly why this debate has become so explosive. Another major dimension of this fight involves Senate procedure, specifically the filibuster. For decades, both parties have argued over whether the filibuster protects democracy or blocks necessary legislation. Now, irony enters the picture. Some Democrats have historically supported eliminating the filibuster to pass voting rights laws, but critics warn that removing it now, if done to pass the SAVE Act, could enable sweeping election changes with only a simple majority vote. In other words, a procedural rule once defended as democratic protection could become the mechanism for passing highly controversial election legislation. And that raises a strategic dilemma. Is changing Senate rules worth the long-term consequences? At the same time, another conflict is unfolding largely outside public attention, in courtrooms across the country. Legal battles are being fought state by state over access to voter registration databases. These databases contain sensitive information used to administer elections. Federal officials have sought expanded access in multiple states, arguing it is necessary to verify voter eligibility and enforce election laws. Opponents argue that centralized access to this data could allow political actors to analyze voting patterns in ways that might enable targeted suppression. Supporters counter that oversight ensures election integrity. The courts are now deciding where that line should be drawn, and the scale is massive, dozens of cases across numerous states simultaneously. What makes this moment unique is that it isn't just one bill or one lawsuit. It's multiple efforts happening at once. Federal legislation proposals, state-level voting law changes, Department of Justice actions, ongoing litigation. Nationwide, critics describe it as a multi-front campaign affecting nearly every layer of election administration. Supporters describe it as long overdue reform correcting weaknesses exposed in past elections. Either way, the scope is unprecedented in modern American politics. Another theme emerging from this debate is whether moderate Republicans will act as a check on Trump's agenda. Historically, media narratives have suggested that certain senators or lawmakers might resist controversial proposals. But critics argue that voting records tell a different story, showing overwhelming party unity on key issues. The question now isn't whether dissent exists privately, but whether it appears publicly when votes actually happen. And recent political history suggests party cohesion often wins out over individual hesitation. The immediate future depends on several unpredictable factors. First, whether House Republicans can maintain unity behind the legislation. Second, whether Senate leadership chooses to push the bill aggressively despite procedural obstacles. Third, how long senators are willing to endure a prolonged legislative fight if opponents launch a sustained filibuster. Unlike dramatic movie scenes, Senate battles aren't decided overnight. A determined minority can delay legislation for weeks or even months through procedural tactics and amendment votes. And that means the political cost, not just the policy, becomes part of the calculation. Regardless of where one stands politically, the broader issue is clear. Election rules shape democracy itself. They determine who votes, how voting works, and how easy or difficult participation becomes. Changes to those rules rarely feel dramatic in the moment. They happen through technical language, procedural votes, and legal arguments, but their consequences can last decades. That's why debates over voting laws consistently produce some of the fiercest political battles in American history. Because every side believes the future legitimacy of elections is at stake. Trump's rhetoric taps into a powerful sentiment among his supporters, the belief that election systems must be tightened to restore trust. Meanwhile, opponents argue that trust is strengthened not by restriction, but by access and transparency. These two visions represent fundamentally different ideas about democracy. One prioritizes security above all else. The other prioritizes participation as the highest value. And modern American politics increasingly revolves around which principle voters believe should come first. It's part of a broader struggle over how elections will function moving forward. The SAVE Act debate isn't only about identification cards or paperwork requirements, it's about power. Who has it? How it's exercised, and how future elections will be decided. And as we move closer to the midterms, this fight is almost certain to intensify. Court cases will continue, legislative battles will escalate, political messaging will grow sharper. Because both parties understand one thing perfectly. Winning the argument over voting rules may shape who wins the elections themselves. I'm Christopher Reynolds. And if you want clear analysis breaking down the political stories shaping our world, not just headlines, but the deeper forces behind them, make sure you stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking questions. Because democracy doesn't just depend on votes. It depends on understanding what happens before those votes are cast.